Mr. Beast is finally fighting back. Just this week, he filed a lawsuit against one of his ex-employees, Leroy Nabors, who originally was subcontracted as an IT consultant but later became an employee. And this lawsuit is insane. According to an article written by Polygon, a former employee of Mr. Beast is accused of not only stealing company secrets, but also of installing hidden cameras throughout the offices. So I wanted to read into the lawsuit and kind of give you guys an in-detailed explanation of what's going on. Now, to really understand the full scope of this lawsuit, I kind of want to give you guys an inside look on who Leroy is and why this is important. Now, I wanted to quickly go over all the characters we're going to mention in this video for those of you who haven't watched any of my previous videos. Obviously, the story revolves around Leroy Nabors, and he's the one we're going to go over first. Leroy was the one who conducted my interview at the beginning of my time working at Beast, and also gave me all my daily tasks. He was essentially my manager, but not on paper. Essentially, his whole plan was to both test and train me, as I got paid by Beast to ultimately end up working under him at his company, which would have been Vine Networks. Leroy originally started working at Beast as a contractor when he was working under a different company. This company he worked for was in charge of supporting all IT needs and services for Beast. And from what I heard, Sean Hendricks offered him a full-time position at Beast in order to get him away from his company. I assume the reason for this is because it's cheaper to have an employee full-time rather than contracting another company to do it. Now, Sean Hendricks was my manager on paper. In my opinion, and I've said it multiple times before, I don't really think he knew anything IT or networking, and he really wasn't around ever anyways. He was essentially just a yes man when we needed something ordered. And like I said, Sean really wasn't ever around. Including for my first in-person interview, I was instructed with letting the front desk know that I'd be speaking with Leroy Nabors. And this is the visitor pass with Leroy's name on it when I had originally visited the company for the first time for my interview. Sean Hendricks' plan was to pick Leroy's brain so they could seamlessly move and transition away from both Leroy and Vine when the time came, because Sean Hendricks' whole position at the company was an IT manager while I was there. He was demoted from chief of staff to just an IT manager. Now, Vine Networks is also mentioned in this lawsuit, and Vine Networks is Kaylie Nabors' company. Kaylie Nabors is the daughter of Leroy Nabors. Leroy was secretly managing and running this entire company by himself, as Kaylie Nabors, in my opinion, also didn't really know much about IT and would mostly just answer any question I had with "ask my dad." Kaylie really just played the role as Leroy's puppet, and for a time, me and Kaylie were actually close friends, and during this time, I had warned her multiple times that she needed to be very careful with essentially letting her dad use both her name and company to work under. But the scariest part in all this to me is just how incompetent Beast was in this entire situation. As a company, they handled this very, very poorly in my opinion. Because although Leroy was fired and no longer in charge of IT per the lawsuit, Vine was still in charge of handling and providing IT services for Beast, even months after Leroy was fired. Now, my theory is Beast didn't really have a plan for transitioning away from Leroy or Vine, and in order to keep minimal downtimes to be able to keep posting, editing, and doing the work they do, they really just didn't have a choice but to have to keep using Vine. Vine essentially, in my theory, had Beast in a full headlock. And now I'm not going to say firing me basically bit Beast in the ass, but I strongly believe everything Vine Networks was taking credit for and charging the Beast company for was essentially handled by me. Now keep in mind, I was not a Vine employee, I was a full-time Beast employee, which meant charging Beast for work that I'd done was essentially straight up robbery. So it's not like Beast was not aware of it. Now, I didn't bring this up without any proof. I had provided tons of proof, hundreds of tickets actually, both handled and created by me while working at the company. Vine had used these tickets that I had made in order to keep working there. All in all, I believe strictly from Vine employees, there may have been a total of just under 10 tickets done in the time I was there. Now, I say this because I had played a very pivotal role in designing, installing, and maintaining the network during my time there, which essentially meant I was so familiar with everything there that staging a cutover with minimal downtime would have been pretty simple for me, considering I had done it all in the first place. And not only had I done it in their main studio, but I had done it in every other office they had. Essentially, I was the only Beast employee that actually knew what was going on. Now, from my understanding, the biggest reason this lawsuit came to be was because Leroy had breached his NDA and stolen a bunch of confidential data from Mr. Beast. And because the company was looking into that matter, they had also found that he had installed hidden secret cameras throughout the offices. It seems Leroy kind of foresaw that he would be fired, and in preparation for this, he exfiltrated thousands of confidential Beast documents, including but not limited to financial data, sensitive memoranda regarding business transactions, and private employee compensation information. Now, Leroy has already declined multiple requests from Beast to return these documents. Apparently, Leroy Nabors saved a bunch of this information on some type of local storage and on a private Dropbox account. Now, after denying to return this confidential information, Leroy began just simply ignoring Beast, which, if we go back to some of his prior lawsuits, it's pretty typical Leroy fashion. Now, you're probably wondering just how exactly Beast found out about this. Well, according to the document, Leroy had turned in his company devices, which he apparently tried to wipe, but the wipe seemed to be incomplete, and Beast's forensics team was apparently unable to uncover both dates and attempted deletions, as well as some information he tried to conceal. Now, Leroy tried to play it off as if he was just doing some routine backups, but apparently, Beast did not have a routine backup policy. But even if they did, apparently Leroy had been removed from his IT responsibilities back in December 2023. Now, after being terminated from the company in October 1st, 2024, Leroy had been told to return all Beast property, which he then responded by saying he only had things such as patch cords and some stuff he found. He had also returned his company-issued laptop, which Beast found out he had attempted to wipe and factory reset 4 days prior to his termination. Now, again on October 8th, Beast demanded that Nabors return all company information in his possession and that he would confirm what he had improperly retained. Nabors did not. On October 21st, Beast once again reached out to Leroy Nabors for him to return all this information. Again, Nabors did not respond. Now, during this time, Beast continued with their investigation on Leroy and his actions throughout the company. And this is when they had found out about his hidden cameras, which apparently no other Beast employee could recall him installing or even mentioning that they were there. On November 15, 2024, Leroy finally decided to respond to Beast's requests. Nabors' counsel stated that all Mr. Beast devices are in North Carolina, in Nabors' residence, and that Nabors can facilitate someone being let into his home to return these devices. Now, it's kind of weird to me that Leroy had to facilitate someone coming into his house for him to return company devices when he said all he had was patch cords and some things he had found. But from my time working with Leroy and working at Beast, Leroy was in charge of ordering all employee devices, which he kept at his house. Nabors factory reset 3 Apple MacBooks, 2 Apple iPads, and 1 Apple Watch. Now, obviously, any company would be terrified if somebody had stolen all their confidential information, including information on investors. For example, apparently much of the financial data is in a draft form, which misinterpretation of that data could cause significant confusion about Beast's business performance, undermining trust between Beast and its investors, customers, and to the public, which to me kind of sounds like they already know there's something fishy going on in there and they're trying really hard to keep it from coming out. Apparently in the documentation it also says if Nabors is not ordered to return the information he improperly has in his possession, Beast will be permanently and irreparably harmed, which I don't know what kind of information he might have, but for consequences this drastic, it's got to be something insane. Now, this whole situation is pretty crazy, and it's got quite a bit of layers to him. On top of that, this document's a little bit confusing to read. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not someone who studies law, so for me it was a little bit hard to understand some portions of it. But what I did understand was some of the technical terms like routine backups and stuff that's pretty standard operating procedures. Now, for a routine backup to be routine, it would mean it's happened at least once in the past. So it'd be pretty easy for either party to dispute whether this is a routine backup or not, just based off of what's happened in the past, whether these routine backups are actually routine or if this is a one-time event. Apparently, Nabors' daughter, Kaylie Nabors, is the sole managing member of a company called Vine Networks, which was contracted by Nabors, which to me is kind of fishy. Now, Vine's responsibilities was to manage Beast's entire IT network. Together, Nabors and his daughter had direct access to the network. Vine continued to have access to Beast networks for months following Nabors' termination of employment, which to me is insane. These guys, Beast allowed Vine to have access to the network for months after Leroy's termination, which essentially meant Leroy had access to the network for months after his termination. Now, I'm not exactly sure when Vine was contracted by Leroy, but it seemed to be early 2024, maybe late 2023, right around the time I was getting there. The whole point of me working at that company was to essentially build an IT company from scratch, and I was the first piece of it. My other manager was Sean Hendricks, which I've talked about in the past, who is also no longer working at Beast. Now, with that being said, Vine was mostly ran by Leroy, and towards the end of my time working at Beast, he started really messing with me and keeping me from being able to do my job, which I believe he was doing it in a way to get me fired. So that's when I had reached out to HR to have him help me with the situation. Now, I wasn't trying to get anyone in trouble or get anyone fired, I just wanted to kind of bring peace to things and just keep it as is. I never had any complaints. I never had any written formal warnings or anything. I was never told I was doing anything wrong. But after bringing up the situation, apparently they had talked to Leroy, who at the time was James Warren, the secret CEO of Beast's best friend. So you can imagine how that turned out for me. Now, according to the document, it states that in December 23, Beast shifted Nabors away from IT responsibilities placed on him at the company's development team. Now, shifted Nabors away from IT responsibilities is a pretty gray line. It doesn't exactly say he no longer was in charge, and it also doesn't say he didn't have access to any of the IT stuff or that he no longer had any responsibilities at all. But what I can tell you from my experience is Leroy was essentially in charge of IT, at least until the point where I left. So from December 2023, when I began working there, all the way up to mid 2024. The document also states that Leroy became a full-time employee starting February 1st of 2024, which from my understanding would mean he'd still be contracted as a IT consultant for the company. So removing him from the position of IT responsibility in December kind of doesn't really line up with the time frame they're given or a lot of the stuff they're saying. In fact, a lot of this document and a lot of this case is just really weird and a little bit off in a lot of different ways. And it's like that because the situation at Beast was very off and weird overall. As I stated previously, I was hired in December to do IT, and I was basically the start of the IT team. They didn't have anyone before me. They just had Leroy and a contracted company that Leroy worked under. Now, my official manager was Sean Hendricks, which I've talked about in a previous video, but he didn't really know anything as far as I could tell network related or really IT related in the least. And Leroy was trying to secretly get rid of Sean, I assume to prevent the buildup of an IT team so that way Vine Networks wouldn't get replaced. But at the same time, Sean was trying to get rid of Leroy while trying to figure out exactly how things were working so that way when Leroy was gone, there wouldn't be an issue of downtime. So just overall, this whole entire situation was pretty messy, and I'm just glad I get to talk about it and that's becoming public because a lot of people thought I was just a shitty employee or whatever it is, and that's fine. I don't really care to argue with people over that. But this just goes to show a little bit of what I went through. It's a lot of messy work there, and I'm glad I get to talk about it so that way people can kind of get a better view of what I went through.
Now, although the entire lawsuit is pretty interesting as is, the part that I'm most interested about is figuring out what happened to Dawson's Apple Vision Pros. Leroy was in charge of handling all the devices that were ordered, which meant he kept a bunch of them at his house, including Dawson's Vision Pros. I do know, however, he was told he'd have to return them, but as far as I could tell, he had never returned them. At least up to the point when I was fired, he still had them at his house. I am interested in knowing if Leroy is enjoying the Apple Vision Pros he probably walked away with.